My name is Thea Lee. I'm president of the Economic Policy Institute, along with the Haas Institute and Johns Hopkins, one of the three co-sponsors of this fabulous conference. And it is really a pleasure and an honor for me to participate in this conference. It's been an amazing day so far with a lot of content, and we have a terrific panel for you this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today. We have Stephen Pitts, the Associate Chair of the Center for Labor Research and Education at Berkeley, Elizabeth Kneebone, the Non-Resident Senior Fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, and Guillermo, the President and CEO of Public Advocates, which aims to improve public transportation services in low-income communities and communities of color. We also have an excerpted interview with Professor William Julius Wilson, who was not able to be with us here in person today because of his teaching schedule, but he kindly agreed to an interview which I conducted at the Kennedy School in January. And Professor Wilson laid out some of the historical context and the big picture for us to frame the conversation we'll have this afternoon. And so if we could go ahead and show the interview with Professor William Julius Wilson.
The fate of African Americans is inextricably connected with the structure and the functioning of the modern American economy, as well as a global economy. You know, that's a fundamental relationship that we should take into account and appreciate. So since the Kerner report, there has been a deepening or growing economic schism between trained and educated blacks and poor blacks. And this gap is sort of reflected in the Gini coefficient. If you look at the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality among a group, ranging from 0, perfect equality, to 1, maximum inequality. Believe it or not, despite the interracial disparity, that is, whites have a much higher average income than blacks. Despite the interracial disparity, the current Gini index is higher among blacks than among whites. The growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in the black community reflected in the sharp increase in the number of blacks with incomes over $100,000. You know, blacks are hardly a monolithic socioeconomic group. I think you could just say that in the early 1970s, the great migration of blacks from the South to the North ended abruptly. Why? Because industries were moving out to the suburbs and to overseas areas. And so the pull factor was removed. The factor that was attracting poor blacks from the South to the North was removed by industry relocation. So the flow of blacks to the North abruptly ended in the early 1970s after the Kerner Commission report. At the same time, higher income blacks were moving out as well. And so this created depopulation as reflected in abandoned buildings and vacant lots in a number of these neighborhoods. The subprime mortgage crisis created some of this, but it was the most fundamental reason was the cessation of migration from the South to the North in the early 1970s. The position of poor blacks looks very bleak indeed. And aside from the effects of current discrimination and the legacy of racial oppression, you also have the computer revolution, the effects of the computer revolution, the globalization of economic activity, the declining manufacturing sector, the downward spiral of unions, and the growth of service industries. I think we're starting to see right now people working together I think women are taking the leadership in this right now. But the women's movement needs to join forces with other movements, including the labor movement, to bring about change. Ordinary people have to be organized in coalitions, in multiracial coalitions to address problems. And first of all, you need to make people aware that they have common problems, common concerns. The commonality is what helps to bring people together. Secondly, you have to emphasize that they can't achieve these common goals without the help of other groups. You have to create a sense of interdependence, making people aware that they need the support of other groups to achieve basic goals that they all share. Decent jobs, decent housing, things of this sort. Adequate pay raises and so on. You know, you talk about the minimum wage, earned income tax credit and so on. But you just need people to recognize that these things are not going to be accomplished without political pressure.
Well, I think Professor Wilson laid out a lot of issues there, and hopefully the panel will touch on them, and then we'll also touch on them with your questions later on this afternoon. So the topic of today's panel, employment, jobs, and transportation, really is the economic foundation for some of the key elements of building a just society. And as Senator Harris said this morning, the centrality of jobs was something that the Kerner Commission really did focus on. He talked about walking through the inner cities with the other commissioners, and people said, "Get us a job, baby," was the line that they heard walking through the cities. And I think we could look at today and say, "Get us a good job, baby," because a lot of what we've seen, and as we look over the last 50 years of economic changes, to see where there's been progress and where there hasn't been progress, one of the things we see is the incredible growth in inequality and the incredible stubbornness of the racial disparities that we've seen over that incredibly long period of time. But and so we look at today we want to explore some of these deeply entrenched patterns of structural racism, occupational segregation, and a broken labor market. How do those come together? What has been the role of government policies? What should be the role of government policies going forward? And we talk about them as measured in some of the key statistics, the hourly wage, the household income, and wealth. And you all have in your program a paper by the Economic Policy Institute, 50 years after the Kerner Commission, where I asked some of our staff to pull together something that would at least update some of the statistics that were throughout the Kerner Commission, particularly in Chapter 7 about labor and employment. And I have to say that just that process of comparing the statistics broke my heart. That I'm 58 years old, I was a child in 1968, and the world seemed like a very different place then. And it seemed like I've spent my career working towards economic justice, and at some level, maybe I've failed, maybe we've all failed, but something pretty deep has gone wrong if over the course of 50 years and all the kinds of policies that were put forward by the Kerner Commission that either were implemented and failed or were never implemented because of political opposition. So that's, I think, the basic groundwork that we are looking at today and that I want us to look at in this today's panel, that there's examples of multiple failures as a society, as a labor advocate, as economists. I'm not going to review all the statistics except to say a couple of the ones that leap off the page, and you'll all look at that paper yourselves, you can do that. But one of them, for example, that the unemployment rate among blacks is twice that among whites. You've heard that today, that's probably familiar to you. That was true in 1968, and even in 1968 in the Kerner report, they said, this is the quote, "Unemployment rates for Negroes are still double those for whites in every category, as they have been throughout the post-war period." So it's not a fact of nature, and yet it is something that has been extraordinarily stubborn. The other one that leaped off the page at me, there was progress in real wages. The gap between black and white wages closed over those last 50 years, but not quite enough. But the gap that didn't close very much was median family income. In 1966, black family income was 58% of white family income. In 2016, it was 61.6%, 50 years later. And in terms of wealth, you did see an accumulation of black wealth. It grew over that period of time, and yet by 2016, it's still, and I think you know this statistic, only 10% of white wealth. And so those are extraordinary failures. But in one of the areas where there was progress, and I think Richard Rothstein mentioned this earlier, the education gap did close, both among black high school graduates, where there was tremendous progress from 54% of blacks had more than a high school education in 1968 to 92% in 2016, closing that gap. And then again for college graduates from 9% to 23%, so more than doubling of the percentage of blacks with a college degree. And yet that makes the income statistics and the wage statistics even worse, because you saw a closing of the educational gap and not as much of a closing of the wage gap. And then, of course, in mass incarceration, it was worse. It got worse over that period of time. So today we're asking our panelists to reflect on what has changed and what hasn't changed in the last 50 years in terms of labor market conditions and outcomes, in terms of geographic and spatial trends, and in terms of transportation and what the impact of that has been on work. But more important than looking back to the last 50 years, we're asking, where do we go from here? How do we ensure that a similar panel in 2068 isn't revisiting these same disparities? And I've heard that, over the course of the last 2 days, there seems to be, and there should be, a lot of impatience and some anger in the room, and that is appropriate. So let me just, without further ado, call on Stephen Pitts to kick us off for our panel. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Thea. And thanks for those that are here, and also thanks for the people organizing this conference. I have to admit that I normally talk, not me looking at the TV in front of myself. So it's kind of distracting. I only look at, wow, look at Stephen, wow. Anyway, but I'll try to look at you, not me, and go forward. And I'm really glad to be here. The year 1968 was really important to me. I was 15 then. So I remember exactly where I was when Johnson said on a Sunday night, I won't run for president again. I remember where I was on Thursday night when King was killed. I know when I was Wednesday morning when I was told by my sister that Bob Kennedy was killed. I know what happened to me when I was driven to high school, seeing the Army on the corners of Chicago because of the riots there. I remember seeing people being beat in Chicago at the convention. So that year, for me, is important. So I'm kind of glad to be here honoring both us and the experience and my life as well. I want to say a couple of opening reflections, then some themes to talk about. One reflection comes off of what Professor Wilson said about the black inequality and the Gini coefficient. That he said quickly, but it's an important one from the context of building political power. We have a fairly clear view that the rising amount of income inequality in the country overall has had a devastating impact on our politics. We're clear on that. But no one raises the question, how does rising black income inequality impact black politics? And so you raise the question, the need to build a stronger black politic to help fight racism. We should raise the question that if it's clear that inequality impacts politics adversely, then how does increasing black inequality impact black politics? Idea for contemplation. Another reflection, to me, it's almost like an analytical asymmetry in terms of how we examine racial hierarchies and inequality and say talk about racism, but we don't talk about income inequality and talk about capitalism. That somehow we just don't do that. And to me, it's almost like wait a second, we can have individual impacts and discuss systems, racism, and we have poverty over here, but we can't talk about capitalism. And I would hope that as we talk about, all of these issues, we think about things in a systemic way. And when we talk about poverty and inequality, we are talking about the manifestations of capitalism. Now, I'm not saying people should have some sort of 120-character version of Miles' Red Book and read it crazily, okay? But I am saying, though, you can't be real about talking about race in America and impacts of inequality and not raise the issue of capitalism. It can't be done. It is simply not consistent analytically to talk about systematic racism and also not talk about systematic capitalism. So a couple of reflections on that. Going forward, one, something that Professor Wilson touched on, we have a different sort of political economy today than back in '68. And so when we talk about what were proposed solutions back then, understand it came out of that condition. And so it's very important to see we have a different time now. And to me, three elements of the difference. We really now are in what I call the age of inequality. If in '68 we were kind of in the so-called golden era of rising equality, that can be discussed a bit more, clearly we're now in the age of rising inequality for a lot of reasons that impacts the nature of how race plays out, the nature of inequality, and the capacity to fight racism and fight inequality. Because sometimes we don't always look at the issue that race and how it plays out is intimately tied with the economy itself. You cannot untie them. Just as the nature of economies is shaped by race, so does the nature of race being impacted by the economy. And so we can't look at the issue of race today through the lens of race 50 years ago. It simply is not accurate. Also, we see the rise of right-wing authoritarianism. That's clearly different from before. Similarly, we see a weakening issue of the political left. It's important because I could dream all day long about what we ought to do, y'all. The question is our ability to impact that. That's a matter of power. And so just as we talk about the question of what policy might change housing, education, healthcare, jobs, we also need to examine how do we develop policies to build the political capacity to change the world. Second thing, I'd like to speak about the issue of the two-dimensional job crises, unemployment and low-quality, low-wage work. Now, in the Kerner Commission report, they talk about underemployment. I like to avoid that term. It's kind of mushy in terms of no consistent definition. So when I speak about low-quality work or bad jobs, it's low wages. It's no benefits. But equally important is the lack of voice at work. It's the lack of unionization. Because for a lot of folk, they want basic respect. And to the extent you have on the job market, in the workforce, this kind of power asymmetry between their boss and themselves, they will never get dignity. And so you raise the question of a bad job, its wages, benefits, and a voice of worker unionization. A third thing to mention briefly, I guess I was asked to talk about labor force participation rates. Well, I could, but no data, whatever. But more importantly is this, people, seriously though. There's a lot of talk about how we've seen declining labor force participation rates or declining employment population ratios. In other words, you see fewer people engaged in the economy now compared to before. One is important to note that predates Kerner, the Kerner Commission report. Second, what's fascinating is one is different by gender and by race. And so if you look at men, there's a clear racial difference in those ideas of employment population or participation rates. But the trend over time is the same, declining. And that duality of having both a racial difference and a secular trend must be held together. I see oftentimes those notion of, they call them missing jobs, is the wrong question politically. People will eat. What's the phrase we say? That we don't work to live, we don't work to live, we live to work? Refresh it around, we don't live to work to live. In other words, if they aren't working, they're still living, how are they doing that? Are they doubling up on the couch? Are they hustling on the side? It's important because the way they pay the bills impacts social relationships and will then impact political capacity and political power. So the question isn't a falling graph. The question is, given that, how are people living? How does it impact the capacity to organize? Last thing to mention briefly, the future of work and race. Now, being kind of old, I remember back in the 60s, the story was automation, the robots, there'll be no jobs. Well, they missed that prediction, y'all. And so when we raise the question of the future of work, we've got to be a bit more nuanced here. And so we look at the question of both the gig economy and automation. We have kind of a simplistic view that says what? The robots are coming, run for the hills. Or they say, we're all becoming gig workers. That kind of simple view is not the nuanced real view. The real question, though, is how do you control the deployment of technology? That is not God-given. That is man or woman-given. And too often in the analysis of the future of work, we don't raise the question of how do we impact the use of technology. Given that, we found that most workers still have a standard non-gig employment relationship. We are not all gig workers. Those that do have gigs, they normally use it to supplement income, not to simply live high in the hard and play in gig and play in gig, okay? Around the robots, the questions are several. One, are they substitutes or are they complements? The robots are coming idea says they're what? They're always substitutes. They can be both. Got to understand that. The question is also what new jobs will emerge from technology. That's also important as well. The last thing on that, then I'm going to go a bit over time, I apologize, is around race, is more just running a crosstab on black folks and displacement or teaching kids how to code. It's also the question of looking at, as we see a new economy, is there upskilling or downskilling? How does race impact that requirement? The last thing on policy teeing up. I think there are two kind of policies to examine. Broad categories, no detail. One simply is, as I said before, what are the policies we can develop that can increase our capacity to change the world? Like developing cities with maximum fiscal participation, so communities can build the capacity to change their environment, not top down. Building unions is another example. Then we can discuss the question of how do we have full employment or guaranteed basic income. But those questions of full employment, basic income, are non-starters today. And they only will be when we make them real. And that's a question of political power. So thanks, people.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Elizabeth?
Thank you. And thanks again for the invitation to be here today and be part of this important conversation. I feel like Professor Wilson and Stephen have done such an articulate job of laying out how complex and multifaceted this conversation is around the labor market. And I just want to take one piece that was teed up, I think, in what Professor Wilson said, one element of this complex labor market discussion to sort of delve more deeply on. And that's the question of geography in determining access. Because he referred to the sort of shifting of jobs, the location of industry, the location of employment, migration patterns, where people can live, where people are moving, and how those two dynamics, how those two elements layer on top of each other really together intersect to affect access to the economy. They weave together to determine where economic opportunity is within a community and who has access to it, who has proximity to those types of opportunities. And since the Kerner Commission report came out, I think over the decades, we've seen both of those dynamics evolve in such a way that today, and looking forward about where we go next, the question of access has gotten harder and it's gotten more complicated from a spatial perspective. If we take that first element, jobs, that Professor Wilson referred to, in the 70s when we started to see industry and employment move away from city centers, move out towards suburbs and and globalize, that really picked up pace in the 70s. That's a pattern that continued in subsequent decades. When we look to the 2000s, we see almost every major metro area saw jobs shift away from the urban core towards that outer-lying suburban fringe. And that happened across all kinds of industries. But the industries that are the most suburbanized, the most decentralized today, tend to be things also referenced in his opening remarks, like service jobs, retail, lower-paying service sector employment, also things like construction or manufacturing. And as we saw those employment, the geography employment change and evolve in that way over the last several decades, it raised real concerns and challenges around what we call spatial mismatch. As we think about those disinvested and distressed urban neighborhoods of low-income African Americans and low-income Latinos in the city being able to access that employment as it shifted farther away, that strain really increased. But at the same time that dynamic played out, the whole underlying geography of people has changed in a way that has complicated that question of access as well. So we still see, as we talked about in earlier discussions and in the last panel, low-income blacks and poor Latinos are still concentrated in cities, still more likely to live in the urban core of our major metro areas. But we've seen broader shifts that are changing this equation. Overall now in our major metro areas, every racial and ethnic group, the majority of every racial and ethnic group now lives in the suburbs. That's the majority of African Americans, the majority of Latinos, the majority of Asian. They now join the bulk of whites in these major metros who live in the suburbs. The majority of poor people now live in suburbs as well in these major metro areas. That's a shift that just happened in the 2000s. So these are significant tipping points in the way that we've historically seen places organized and the distribution of population across places. And when you look at this shift of the poor into the suburbs, it's actually poor blacks and poor Latinos who saw the biggest tip towards the suburbs during the 2000s. They have yet to cross that threshold, which really shows, I think, some of the dynamics we've talked about, particularly in the last panel, just the systemic and historical segregation patterns that even now, these poor residents lag behind their higher income peers and higher income and poor whites in terms of that spatial organization. But nevertheless, together, these broader trends really raise the question of what does access look like now in these markets? And the reality is that it's gotten harder. Because even though on first blush, we think, well, more jobs in the suburbs, more poor people, more people of color in the suburbs, that should be a good thing for opportunity. In fact, as people have spread out and as jobs have spread out, we've lost density in doing that in these places. It means they're farther apart. So in fact, we've actually seen jobs get farther away from poor people and from people of color. Over the 2000s, between 2000 and 2012, the typical African American in our major metro areas saw the number of nearby jobs drop by 14%, the typical Latino by 17%. That's more than twice than what we saw for overall workers. Again, so it's gotten worse for all workers, but particularly we saw those drop-offs even more steeply for people of color and for low-income residents. And we ask why? Why would we see these disparate patterns? And it gets back to the disparate patterns we've seen for decades historically about, these trends are happening, but they're not happening evenly across places. So jobs aren't just evenly spreading out into the suburbs, they're clustering in corridors of opportunity. They're growing faster in certain parts of these regions and often not in the parts where we're seeing poverty grow and concentrate in these places. Kind of going back to Myron Orfield's maps from the last panel, as we've seen poverty grow in the suburbs and poor people of color move to the suburbs, what we're seeing in some ways is a resegregation. Concentrated poverty grew steeply in the 2000s, but it grew at the fastest pace. The incidence of high poverty neighborhoods, the growth of poor people living in high poverty neighborhoods happened at the fastest pace in suburbs. And as we've seen these pockets of poverty now sort of resegregate in new suburban contexts, what we've actually seen is job opportunities for those neighborhoods actually fell at a steeper pace. Residents of those those neighborhoods saw opportunity move farther away. And that's particularly challenging given the fact, or there is again that racial dynamic and the segregation element there when you see that poor people in the suburbs who are black, more than half of them live in a neighborhood that has a poverty rate of 20% or more. More than half of Latinos in the suburbs live in a higher poverty neighborhood. So this element shows that the deepening challenge that has moved not only persists in the urban core, but now is being recreated in new contexts within suburban communities. The challenge being there, as we see this mismatch growing, it's harder to overcome with things like transit when we think about it in the suburban context or in these broader outer lying communities now. And I know Guillermo is going to talk a lot more about that in his remarks. But it really underscores as we think about how do we fix that mismatch. Not that proximity is everything, but proximity matters. It matters in terms of who has access to what kinds of jobs, what sorts of of pay is available within a community, it matters. And we're seeing this landscape really change in a way that is not, in fact, it's running counter to what 50 years ago in the Kerner Commission had been recommended. And it underscores how within the labor market, we need to think about not just growing jobs in these regions, not even just the types of jobs that are in these regions, but where they locate. And what policies can we espouse, what sort of incentives can we provide that brings more of those economic opportunities closer to these distressed communities, closer to communities of color. In addition, it really underscores what the last panel was talking about, how housing matters. Where is housing located and where can people afford to live within these regions, and how does that line up in terms of access to economic opportunity? And in a community where, in the current context, jobs and affordable housing are not close together, what are the transit options that help offer reliable, affordable ways to connect people to the types of labor market opportunities that can give them a more stable economic outlook and mobility over time? And the truth is, all three of those things need to be happening at the same time. Too often, we take these as siloed approaches that, in fact, can end up exacerbating disparities along income and race, rather than thinking cohesively and in an integrated way and from a regional perspective about how to best serve people in distressed inner city communities, as well as some of these declining suburban areas that are now more and more finding opportunity out of reach. So thinking in terms of looking forward about the policies that provide that sort of integrated, comprehensive approach, it's a long-term strategy. And I think we see some regions, I'm getting the signal that my time is up. So I just want to say there are actually good models across the country that are emerging that show that more comprehensive thinking, that more regional outlook that takes into account this changing geography of poverty and of opportunity that we're facing today and looking forward. There are also communities in the short term who are figuring out how to overcome some of these gaps and fixes, and I think that those models, which we can talk more about, really help lay the groundwork for more forward thinking and more updated policy to really connect people to opportunity regardless of where they live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that. And I hope we will have time in the Q&A and the back and forth to go a little bit more deeply into some of those policies. Guillermo.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Let me first start by thanking the Haas Institute for inviting us to be on this panel and for the opportunity for me to share with you some reflections on this, the 50th anniversary of the report from a transportation equity perspective. And I really want to continue the topic of the spatial mismatch between people and opportunity and talk about how our transportation systems contribute to that mismatch or to the solution to those that mismatch. My comments are going to try to cover both questions. This is a little bit ambitious for 10 minutes, so I'm also giving you some potential questions for me in the Q&A. What does transportation have anything to do with the findings and recommendations of the Kerner Commission report? Beyond the report, what has been the role of transportation systems in perpetuating the inequality that 50 years later continues to grip our cities and our metropolitan regions? Also, if we're going to disrupt, I think, Steve, you said on the phone that the durability of this inequality, what transformative changes are needed in transportation and land use? And then how do we build the political power to win that change? Again, that's too much for me to cover in 10 minutes. But, so let me start with what does transportation have anything to do with the Kerner Commission report? Because if you read it, you will find that it's mentioned about 2 times in here. I was pretty frustrated when I reviewed the summary and there was nothing about transportation, and I'm a transportation junkie. And I feel like maybe I should start making the case first and foremost as to why transportation was so relevant, what was happening at the time of the Commission and its findings in the immediate past decades and what came afterwards, and why U.S. transportation policy contributed to this whole situation. Because if you look at the oppressive conditions that are documented in the report, such as housing segregation, the ghettoization of black communities, chronic unemployment, the underinvestment in the urban core, the lack of economic opportunities for black Americans, all of those conditions that gave rise to the summer of '67 I would argue were facilitated and exacerbated by US transportation policy backed by unprecedented levels of federal spending in that sector, right? Mainly the construction of the US interstate highway system under President Eisenhower in the post-war period, which for the first time connected the 48 contiguous states, is what helped expedite and the greatest migration of whites in US history out of cities and into the suburbs, right? The Highway Act that authorizes was passed in 1956. And while we know that white flight and suburbanization can be traced back to the beginning in the early 1900s, and then it stopped for a bit during the Depression, white flight and rapid suburbanization peaked in the 50s and the 60s at the very height of desegregation efforts, right? So right when people were securing formal civil rights and desegregating public schools and public accommodations, the right to vote, to be free from discrimination in housing and employment, from discrimination in federal spending, we see the peak in white flight. And think about this, if you support segregation, or if you don't want to live in an integrated society, why continue to live in an integrated city, in a city that's integrating, when you can drive your family car onto a newly built highway, paid for by the feds, and move to a newly built suburb subsidized by the feds that keeps people of color out? And I just want to emphasize, and by the way, and the cherry on top is, and take your tax base with you. I just want to emphasize that the spatial separation of whites and non-whites over these large distances simply would not have been possible without massive investments in highways, right? Before this coherent system of highways, it was impractical for the average white family to move too far from the city. You simply wouldn't be able to access city jobs and the amenities and services that the city provided that had not yet developed in the early suburbs. So there was a check based on what transportation was available, right, on the ability to flee the city. And developers could have built as many racially exclusive suburbs around cities as much as they wanted, but without an efficient way to transport those residents across these long distances to city jobs, rapid suburbanization never would have flourished in America. Highways turned a trip that would take hours into a trip that would take minutes, and whites left the cities in droves, right? So, and I would say that the most hardcore segregationist couldn't have dreamed up a better way to separate races than through highways, right? And on top of that, to physically destroy countless historic black neighborhoods, because guess whose houses were bulldozed to make way for highways, right? Millions were displaced, and since they had no other place to go, they couldn't move to the suburbs because of the racially restricted covenants, right? They had to move to other parts of the cities and contribute to the overcrowding and the ghettoization that was happening, right? And not to mention the fact that the mass transit systems that flourished prior to the rise of highways in the cities, they swiftly entered a death spiral with a massive loss of ridership and the tax base that supports mass transit systems in cities. So people of color in the city were left with even worse transportation and mobility and further locked in. So I just want to emphasize, US policy, transportation policy has been brutal to the black community, right? And can be brutal again, not just to the black community, but to all people of color and many other groups. And the living tragedy is that these decades where we saw this highway-centered form of mobility rise in America cemented into place the dominant blueprint for transportation, policy and investments that continue today. Today, 80% of federal dollars spent on transportation go to the construction, maintenance, and expansion of highways. and 20% goes to mass transit. And I'll get to mass transit in a second. And we have to just remind ourselves that our current form of transportation facilitates the separation of communities by race and ethnicity and income. It contributes to the fragmentation of the tax base, and that is what helps create the mismatch between people and opportunity. So now, it hasn't been until recent decades that we've started to understand what a terrible position our transportation policy has put us in. And you're seeing some shifts in the right direction, but there's all these dangerous places where we can repeat the same mistakes by not being aware of how transportation policy and where we locate jobs and opportunity impact folks. So now you're seeing people come back to the cities. You're seeing massive capital, private capital as well as public investment come back to the cities. People paying a premium to live in walkable, bikeable, hip urban neighborhoods, right? And the market reflects that. And now you're seeing transit cater more and more. Before transit in the 60s and 70s, when it was being built or sustained and supported by the feds, a lot of that favored the commuter, right? Because they also started experiencing congestion and everything on highways. And BART is a perfect example of a system that was built to bring people outside into the urban core. Now you're seeing, with gentrification, with the focus back in the city, mass transit, one, initially cater to the needs of the more affluent, and usually through like deluxe rail and those kinds of services, and underinvestment in bus service. And now you're seeing transportation providers like Lyft and Uber compete and undermine the very viability of mass transit systems. So I'll wrap up there.
Well, thank you so much to all three of the panelists. So there's a ton on the table right now, and I wanted to start with one question for the panel, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Get ready, get your questions ready, because we're coming to you very soon. But I wanted to start with a question about the racial disparities. And if we look back over the last 50 years, we can see, of course, and we've talked about it over the last couple of days, that there have been some overall gains. There are fewer people in poverty, both black and white. There have been overall increases in wealth, wages, and income. There are more legal protections on paper and less, actual legal discrimination in terms of laws. But the labor market has utterly failed workers in the middle class over the last 30 years, and that is black, white, Latino, Asian, and Native American. And so I think that's, in some ways, when we look at the labor market and we look at the failure of jobs, we have to put that lens on it. And I think this goes to one of the points that Stephen made in terms of, what are the systemic issues here, that this isn't just, as somebody said earlier, not about tweaking around the edges. We're talking about a really systemic failure, so that we've had wage inequality and wage stagnation for the entire labor market. So, if you look at the real wage gains for black and white, real wages over the last 50 years grew at 0.6% a year, and for whites at 0.2%. So you can say, well, that's progress. The black wage gain was greater, but of course from a much lower base. And for both of those groups, that was pathetic. That was ridiculous. That was over a period of time when productivity and the economy were growing, and yet all the gains were going to the top. And it goes back to the issue that Stephen raised about bargaining power and about dignity, and what the failure of the labor market has been. And I want to tie it to the spatial inequity in the transportation. But as an economist, we look at the failure to maintain full employment and a tight labor market over those years, the attacks on unions, the wrong kind of globalization, the attacks on government and the public sector, and the erosion of labor standards and protections. But then on top of that, we have the inequities that grew out of segregated housing patterns and out of inequitable transportation policies that Guillermo and Elizabeth talked about. So what would it take? And what kind of policies and what kind of political movement? And I think Professor Wilson talked about the need to build a multiracial, intersectional coalition if we're going to be successful. So what kind of political movement and what kind of policies should that be pushing will it take for us to make durable progress? And I invite any of you to leap right in.
So I'd love to talk about a coalition, a kind of a very real example of how we've seen some incredible organizing happen in the Bay Area. A coalition made up of not the usual suspects come together and push for policies that were quite transformative. This is the Six Winds Network in the Bay Area that we've been a part of for many years, and they are intervening at the regional level, understanding that the barriers between the boundaries between jurisdictions in the Bay Area are largely artificial when we all have a common economy and housing markets, et cetera. And trying to address the inequality in geography, right, by connecting the 9 counties of the Bay. These are transportation advocates, folks fighting for better jobs, public health, EJ, land use and smart growth advocates came together about 2 planning cycles ago to envision a very different way of growing our region. Our metropolitan planning organization called the Metropolitan Transportation Commission was developing a 30-year plan on how this region is going to grow, where our jobs are going to be located, where our transportation infrastructure is going to be placed, and where's housing going to go. $300 billion at stake, and the Six Winds Network was able to present an alternative vision to what the agencies were promoting. Sometimes we call it the 5% plan, because all we did was shift about 5% of the funding away from highways into transit, shift some of the growth in housing, not just concentrated in existing communities of color, but to put them into high opportunity suburbs that are job rich and transit connected. And then we included in this scenario greater protections for tenants and neighborhood stabilization policies. And this, when studied through the environmental review process, this coalition was able to outperform the very proposal from the agencies, and it certainly was the most equitable and ended up being the most environmentally it was the environmentally superior alternative. It made a huge statement about the ability to begin with equity at the center, looking at the needs of the lowest income folks in the Bay Area, looking at their transportation needs, their housing needs, their mobility, their jobs, envisioning a planning process that has that at the core. And just to give you some example of how this alternative scenario, it reduced the difference between that and what the agency proposed. It reduced daily 3.5 million fewer miles of car travel per day, 165,000 more people using transit per day, 1,900 fewer tons of CO2 emissions per day, energy savings amounting to 600,000 gallons of gasoline per day, savings for lower income households amounting to $79 million per year in the aggregate. It put 30,000 fewer residents underwater, meaning that it was better in terms of adaptation and preventing locating housing near places that are going to be flooded in future years. So the Six Winds Network was really able to bring together a broad coalition of actors to address transportation, land use, housing, the environment, jobs, public health, simultaneously in a regional planning exercise. Now, we weren't naive enough to think that by outperforming our regional agencies, they were going to go ahead and adopt that plan. There's not quite yet the political will, right, to win it. But there's the creativity and the energy to envision it. And that's, I think, a very important first step.
Elizabeth, do you want to delve a little more deeply into some of the policies you were starting to talk about at the end of your presentation that could bring together some of these different threads around spatial mismatch and geography?
Yeah, and
job
I think,
markets.
and this is such an excellent example of the leadership that we're seeing from a local and regional level to sort of show the more creative, forward-thinking ways to connect the dots across these different what are traditionally policy silos. A couple examples that came to mind as well when I was coming up with my remarks is thinking about there's an opportunity in some regions in a forward-thinking way to take advantage of things like transit expansion. So, for instance, in the Denver region, which had already committed to invest deeply in its expansion of its transit network, you had alongside that the formation of an organization, again, a sort of cross-sector partnership with a lot of different partners coming to the table called Mile High Connects, and a development at the same time of a Denver regional transit-oriented development fund. So you have multiple partners working together to think about how do we seize this opportunity to make it sure that this happens in a way that increases access for communities of color, for low-income residents, that they aren't displaced from this expansion process, but there are opportunities for those populations to benefit from this transit expansion, or where possible, can we create or preserve affordable housing options around this transit build-out? Can we think about how to bring jobs or community services around these transit accessible hubs? And then the Regional Transit Development Fund was actually the putting together of flexible resources that would then allow for the acquisition of land and development of housing or preservation of housing in those areas. So again, it's sort of that fund was a blending of public-private dollars and a partnership across different entities, to sort of bring that together in that sort of forward-thinking, take advantage of this longer-term planning to weave equity into that. But then also you have communities where maybe, think of like a St. Louis region where there isn't that sort of build-out opportunity, but you're still dealing with a regional labor market, a lot of disparities and segregation. How do we create connections to the labor market in a way that helps low-income residents in cities and suburbs, African Americans, connect to labor market opportunities? And in that situation, you had a provider, Met Center, basically pull together 16 different programs into one location, partner with 21 different partners across the region to co-locate job skills training and wraparound services like financial planning and transportation planning for the participants in these training programs. And at the same time did outreach to the community college and to employers to make sure that they're creating the types of training that would actually find jobs in the labor market, that were skill sets that were in demand by the jobs that were there and growing and good paying in the region. What they layered on top of that, besides the co-locating and getting past the sort of fragmentation of services in the skills training space, was also an intentional outreach to opportunities that were transit accessible. So that they took a metropolitan approach to this, looking at the region, the labor market as a region, and working with employers and service providers who could actually be accessible throughout urban and suburban communities. And I think that's a good example of starting where you are in terms of where the labor market opportunities are, where the residents who need services are, and finding ways to work within that frame to connect, increase both skills and access to jobs from a skills and spatial perspective. So I think that those sorts of again, those principles, that thinking regionally, figuring out flexible approaches that work across the urban-suburban continuum, that link up exactly these actors in the transportation space, housing, economic development, and workforce, critical and education, critical to sort of thinking about the multifaceted issues at hand. But I also want to layer on top of that forward thinking. This is all also just figuring out how to work within a system that's not working, right? That eventually we need more connectivity, we need more proximity to employment and access to jobs. But if the jobs aren't paying enough, it's only going to get us so far. So I do think that there are an additional level of policies that really need to operate at a higher level than the metropolitan area. Things like wages. Are we talking about minimum wages, not just being raised at the city level or metropolitan level, which those communities are real leaders in figuring out how to boost incomes for low-income working and for workers in their regions. But really, that's something that needs to happen at a bigger scale, right? That should be happening at the state and federal level across the board. Also, thinking about, we talked about the erosion of labor protections, we have the rise of low-wage work, right? If you look at occupations that are slated to be the fastest growing over the next decade, you have a lot of home health aides, healthcare and service jobs that pay $20,000 a year. You have retail and service sector jobs slated to grow, to continue to grow. Looking within those occupations, within those industries, to understand the practices that may be suppressing wages or making it hard for workers to make ends meet is critical, particularly with the erosion of more traditional labor protections. So scheduling practices that don't allow a service worker to work 40 hours a week, to have to hold that schedule open, when maybe they could put together two jobs. That's not ideal, but if they could have the opportunity for flexibility, they could work more than one job to boost their take-home wages. Within the home health aid sector, a colleague of mine at Brookings, Martha Ross, has done a lot of good work at looking at what are pathways so that $20,000 home health aid has a way to increase their skills and continue to move up the healthcare job ladder, considering that's such a large and fast-growing sector of our economy. So I think, again, getting past the spatial element is critical, but there are also just larger level moves we need to make sure that when people work, they can keep their families above poverty and they can find their way to economic security.
And I think that's exactly right, Elizabeth. And of course, that's sort of the intersection between the macroeconomic policies that are needed, the national policies, and what happens at the local level. Stephen, you talked about the role of unions, and I just want sort of quickly to come back to that, because I worked at the AFL-CIO for 20 years, so just as a full disclosure, I'm not totally objective on this front, but in the Kerner Commission report, there was one piece of it where they praised the building construction unions for making apprenticeships available to people of color in inner cities, and they urged more action on that front. Now, back in 1968, unions had a pretty mixed record in terms of racial equality and racial inclusion, as well as gender issues. But the labor movement now is 2/3 of union members who are covered by union contracts are women and people of color. 46% are women and 36% are non-white. So the labor movement's very different today than it was. And of course, the labor movement is the original multiracial intersectional coalition where people don't come together because of their politics or because of their race or because of their gender. They come together because they happen to work at the same place and because they are united in the desire for decent work and for a voice at work and for dignity. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that over the last 50 years there has been a concerted right-wing rich person attack on unions. And today, as we speak, unions are under severe attack at the Supreme Court with the case that's attacking public sector unions. And so I guess that's one question is, Stephen, how can people come together and recognize the value of what unions can bring to workers and bring that voice on the work, bring the ability to fight back and to even have a political voice as well as a voice on the job?
I would answer that at two different perspectives. One, sometimes we're given this kind of mystical view of how wages are determined. If you take an econ class, we run into some graphs around marginal productivity of labor, or we think that we actually earn it because we're better. And the reality is that most times, your wages is a function of power. That's simply, if you come to a job and they ask you what you want to get paid, you get a good answer to them, right? But they tell you what you want to get paid. And so first, the issue is, one, if the question is that of simply wages, the issue is how do you form the collective organization to change that balance of power? That is fundamental. No jobs are inherently good-paying jobs. They're good-paying jobs because the person who has that job has the capacity to demand and receive a better wage. So step one is the question of simply wages, you need a union. But beyond that, though, if you think of the question of larger political transformation, that's a function of our political society. and how well we're organized. And across the board, what happened during this age of inequality has been a deterioration of old forms of organizing our lives. As we become more atomized as a society that allows the right to gain power over us. And so the importance of organizing unions says that it's a new form, it's an additional form of organization that can change the question of democracy. And what's amazing, we can discuss democracy from the point of view of the ballot box, or having people have a say in terms of economic development. But we should also talk about democracy in the workplace. That should be an equally important and valid thing to talk about. And so both from the perspective of wages and from the perspective of a better functioning society and democracy, we should talk about workplace organizations and unions.
Great. Let's open it up for questions to the audience, and I'd like to particularly invite those of you who have not yet had an opportunity to ask a question to come to the microphone. I see plenty of you out there who haven't yet had a chance to speak, so I'd like to invite you. I know it's late in the day, but there's still a lot of good questions out there. So first.
Greetings. My question
And
is...
introduce yourself. Just
I'm
so we know.
sorry.
That's okay.
My name is Kiwan Gore, and I am a finance person. My question is for the panel. With regards to the new current 1099 status of work defined, could you please talk about or around 1099 wages versus employment and with benefits, and how the 1099 structure, this new structure that Amazon, eBay, everyone is keeping, especially African Americans, impoverished because we're not able to get regular standard jobs any longer. So maybe we can talk around that.
Thank you for that question. Stephen?
So real quickly, part of the problem is the issue of misclassification. So people who are actual regular workers are told they're independent contractors, and they get kind of pushed into a 1099 world, right? And so
Tell people what that is for those. Yeah. It's a tax status where instead of being an actual employee, you are sort of an independent contractor. And lots of companies are abusing that status.
And the importance is you lose all your labor rights when you're an independent contractor. And so the first step is to properly classify folk. The second question would be, if there are some changes in the economy where people might kind of cross a line from the old way of being a worker to something else, how do you give those people who may be, quote unquote, more mobile than before, some sense of collective efficacy to still, when they engage with their boss, they have the capacity to negotiate in ways to bring them power, be it better wages, better benefits, and so forth. So the starting point is to properly classify people, and second, to find new forms of classification that gives them the capacity to organize collectively to get better results.
Yeah, and I would just add a little bit to that, because this is something that the Economic Policy Institute, where I work, is putting a lot of focus on what we call first-day fairness right now, which is that there's a whole series of ways in which employers have systematically denied workers power, leverage, bargaining power. So misclassification is one of them, that when you walk into the job on the first day, sometimes you don't know who you work for, and therefore you don't know who to ask for a raise or who to try to organize a union around. And so if employers have really abused this ability to put workers into the wrong status, and they, as Stephen said, they've lost a lot of power, they've lost the right to form a union, because all of a sudden now it's called collusion. If you're a bunch of independent contractors and you get together to talk about wages, that can be a violation of antitrust laws. That you're not protected as an employee. And of course, you lose minimum wage and maximum hours and safety and health protections as well. But also, employers are now forcing these forced arbitration clauses or non-compete clauses on workers. And this is something that we're trying to fight back against sort of in a broad way. So instead of taking them one at a time, but trying to put all these together so that people can see all the different ways in which employers have really used their market power to deny workers rights they used to have, constitutional rights they used to have to sue their employer for discrimination or an unsafe workplace, and that they've been denied. Anybody else want to throw anything in? Okay, we'll go to the next question.
I have a couple of points. One is regarding
Introduce yourself.
Brian Brackney. One of the things regarding transit was during the mid-'70s, there was a boost in suburban mass transit as well as a reduction in costs, and that was because of the oil shocks. You had, when the Arab oil embargo hit the U.S. in the fall of '73, gas prices skyrocketed, and the view was to get people out of their cars to try to save oil because our oil supply was becoming uncertain. So you had a lot of suburban bus companies pop up now, things like Orange County Transit, but they're not that great. It took me actually I got late here because it took me 3 hours to get here from Antioch, which is a poor suburb. That's the only place I could get public housing and not be cooped up in an SRO. Now, the other thing was prior to the 60s, you had a different set of values. There was a sort of understanding among business with, I think, some exceptions, but the vast majority of business had the view that regulation was necessary, that business had to be a team player, that business would be a partner with government, that business was there to make a profit, but they also had to be there for public service. And that began to change in the mid-'70s. I think it was part of an unfortunate side effect of what happened in the '60s, which was our becoming more tolerant of nonconformity. You had a kind of individualist mentality, which is very strong in Silicon Valley. Can any of you talk about those issues?
Well, I'm happy to talk about the transit piece at the beginning of your comment, sir. In '64, I think was the first Mass Transit Act that was authorized by Congress and followed in the '70s as well. You saw the federal government play a larger role in actually supporting the development of mass transit systems. Again, a large priority for moving white-collar commuters from suburban areas into the urban core as opposed to supporting robust local buses in cities and Right, and in LA, they started to dismantle the bus service to give rise to light rail, right? The Bus Riders Union lawsuit in the '90s really helped highlight the racism in transportation, even in mass transit policies and decision-making. But I want to say one point about, and you mentioned the 3-hour ride from Antioch, right? One of the things is the federal government started getting out of the business of funding transit operations, in part as an anti-union policy, because you pay for operations, you're paying for salaries, and transit jobs are unionized. And by the way, they have a very good tradition of having people of color and especially black leadership. These are jobs that are usually occupied by folks from the same communities where they're driving their routes, right? So when you have, under Reagan and then ultimately under Clinton, the elimination of federal support for transit operations, you start seeing support for capital projects continue and grow, but service got worse and worse and worse, and transit unions took a big hit during that period.
And just briefly, in terms of the shift in business values, I think that there was a big shift, and maybe in 1980 with Ronald Reagan, where there was the attack on unions, it became more socially acceptable for businesses to be more selfish and more short-term oriented, and I think a lot of those changes really did provide a contrast where there was maybe there had been maybe more of an understanding that as businesses were profitable, of course they were going to share their profits with their workers, and that they considered more stakeholders to be part of their circle, their inner circle, and then that shift became that the only thing that mattered was profits and short-term profits, and that did, I think, really made a contrast also between the United States and some European countries where there was still a sense of social partners. Let's take,
one quick thing. I mean, norms don't drop from the sky, y'all. Ideas that just pop up out of nowhere. The norms that existed were a function of actual political battle. And firms weren't nice and then got evil. They were forced to be nice at some level, and then they had the capacity to be evil. Once again, that's kind of a little too strong, sorry. You know what I'm saying, though? This is very important, because oftentimes we look at ideas that they exist in the atmosphere, have an independent life. They come from the real world. And to the extent we discuss one of changing ideas, the starting point has to be not the idea, but what gives rise to the idea itself. If you don't start there, you will not be effective. So we want to change the norms. I say change the material conditions, and the norms shall follow. Not quite what they said back at the Funkadelics, but that's okay.
Well, that's absolutely right. Let's take 2 more questions, thanks, from the microphone.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Laura Watry. I'm wondering if
Close to the mic.
I'm wondering if anyone on the panel could comment on access to jobs in rural areas. We've heard a lot about the dynamic between urban and suburban. That relationship with respect to employment. I'm wondering if there are any sort of patterns or trends that you're seeing that are different in rural areas. I know one thing a lot of rural communities are facing is this outmigration of folks with post-secondary degrees because there just aren't opportunities for them in rural areas, and so they'll move to the nearest metro. So I guess part of the question is, what can these areas do to create opportunities to retain some of those workers and the higher educated workers, and also just improve quality and access to jobs for workers with, just in general. Thanks.
Thank you. And let's take the 2 questions, and then we'll go to the... Oh.
Thank you. So my name is Garrett Hall, and I'm studying the racial impact of the current and incoming Medicaid work requirements, and wondering if the panel can share thoughts on the racial impact of those requirements, whether from welfare or from what you think will happen with Medicaid going forward.
Great, thanks very much. On that first question, Elizabeth, that seemed like that was up your alley.
Yeah, and I'll say the study that I pulled those stats from on what we've seen in terms of job proximity in urban and suburban areas also looked at rural communities and found a similar pattern. Like, this has been across communities, partly reflecting the impact of the Great Recession, but also just that more diffuse development sort of form. So we've seen the number of jobs near the typical rural resident also fall over the 2000s. The other thing is, you can look at the snapshot numbers and see, because of the sort of density question, the number of jobs we're talking about really falls off as well. So the number of job opportunities, which is, again, not surprising, just given the built environment and the nature of these communities. So I'd be happy to point you towards that resource to dig into particular communities. But I will say that even these aggregates I'm talking about, clearly that hides a lot of variations within communities and across different parts of the country. That there are some positives that are lurking underneath these disaggregated stats in terms of places that have managed to create more connectivity, to create more proximity. There are even steeper divides than what I sort of presented in these aggregates that, again, hew, I think, along lines that are not surprising given historical patterns of segregation and just broader changes in the labor market. And when it comes to what we do in rural communities, I mean, I think, especially post the last presidential election, that has been on the top of a lot of discussions in a lot of people's minds, and what is the economic answer for these places that are struggling. And I will just say I think there's some good work being done out of the Ohio State University around rural communities and rural economies that talks about the diversity that exists even within that landscape, that there are different types of rural America where the economic outlooks are different, some much brighter because there are amenities, there are natural resources to draw from and to build around to try and create that economic and retain economic opportunity and jobs within those communities. And then there are places that are really more distressed, where the question is, yes, what do we do about jobs, but also what are the wraparound supports that are missing in these places because unemployment is is not coming back anytime soon. So what is the longer term strategy for those communities? And I think being able to disaggregate some of these places is a really important nuance to the conversation, but also underscores again where there might be a state or federal role or gap in what we're doing in some of these communities to ensure that people have economic stability even in times of economic transition and restructuring.
Thank you. Stephen, on Medicaid work requirements? No? Okay. Just in terms of the Medicaid work requirements, this is something, I think this is basically a harassment effort, and it's also a way of trying to kind of just polarize and divide people, because a lot of the folks who are on Medicaid who can work are working. And the ones who aren't, some of them are disabled, and some of them are also in areas with, with a poor labor market. And so, just instructing people to go out and work, I think, is just another part of the kind of the Republican fantasy about what's wrong, that you have a bunch of lazy people drawing on Medicaid. And in fact, it's really, I don't even think there's very much juice there in terms of the impact or the number of jobs that might, number of hours that people might work and so on. So it is something actually, that we're looking into at EPI, because we want to put together a quick report on that, just to say, first of all, how dopey it is, and second of all, whom it might hurt. I think it's, clearly hurts people who, people with families and people who are trying to make sure their kids have access to decent health care. And already you have a problem with Medicaid, which is that some people, if they work too many hours, then you have the problem that they lose their health care and they don't get a job that is going to provide decent benefits. And so that puts people into a terrible, terrible bind. So, yes, one more question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll try to be brief. We have 28 transit agencies in the Bay Area, and they all compete when they're applying for the federal funding that's actually dwindling. And we've done the sustainability project that looks at how transit agencies in the Bay Area should merge, and that was the recommendation, and we got one merger out of it. So then we went to 27 agencies, and then we started a ferry agency, so we're back at 28. My question is, the funding pendulum swings for transit, and the 90s were decent. There was some investment in the Clinton era, Ice-T. You moved to the 2000s and the wars in the Middle East, and you lost funding. We got a little bit more funding in the Obama era, and so we're about to swing back to the no funding piece. How can we afford to fund 28 CEOs, 28 planning directors, 28 operations directors, 28 dispatchers, and not to mention, when we're looking at funding these agencies, it's typically the loudest voices that get the funding. So you get BART extensions to San Jose, to a city that probably needs BART but never paid into the BART district, and you have the poor community like Antioch that has all of our folks pushed out of the mission, and they can't, it takes them 3 hours to get here. So how do we fix the sustainability of our transit agencies and fund projects that are actually going to move commuters that need the resources the most, and not the discretionary rider that transit's been chasing the last 20 years?
Guillermo?
If I can solve your, if I can give you a good answer to that, I won't need my job anymore. But that's a real challenge. So many transit agencies, even, you talked about the administrative duplication and the cost of that, but imagine just being a person that relies on transit that has to get from this part of the region to that part of the region, everything you have to navigate to get there. It's not a seamless connection, right? Right, exactly, right? So it's a real challenge. I think regional governance is potentially one way where, and I do believe that regions need to be stronger, regional governments need to be stronger, but they also need to be more democratic and accountable, and they're not right now, right? Nobody knows who MTC and ABAG are. Nobody knows on the street. They know BART is maybe, right, and AC Transit. And that's where the decisions are being made at a huge, huge scale, with little transparency, no political accountability. And even though elected officials do sit on that commission, for example, they're not elected to serve there by the public. So you can't hold them accountable if they're a county supervisor in such county, for the votes they took at MTC. So regional government could begin to address this fragmentation of our transit system, but as you give them more power to do that, you have to also, I think, give them much more democratic processes and accountabilities, right? And we're kind of inching our way there. You saw the recent addition of seats for Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco, after many, many years of severe underrepresentation of high-dense areas. On the funding piece, you know, the Highway Trust Fund, where the mass transit account lives, is going to go bankrupt in a number of years, right? Republicans refuse to raise gasoline taxes. It's also a dwindling source of revenue because of efficiencies in automobile technology, the electrification of and alternative fuels, et cetera. And it's a real challenge, and the feds really want to get out, at least conservative members in Congress want to get rid of, they call it removing the federal government from the, what do they call it? They essentially want to stop funding transit, right? They want to and enter into these public-private partnerships as somehow the solution for keeping those systems going, or privatizing, as you're seeing actually in some jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions are straight out just privatizing their transit. It's a real challenge. We have to get really creative. I'll tell you one thing that we've done in California that helped hopefully boost support for transit a little bit, and that's the funding from the cap and trade system, right? That's a very controversial system in California, but we've been able to persuade legislators and the governor to dedicate a portion of those revenues, right, 5% every year, to go straight into improving mass transit. So we got out of the kind of paying it through the gas tax, really recognizing the role that transportation plays in increasing greenhouse gases as the single largest sector contributing to that in California. So we've been able to find kind of creative ways, but it's far from being able to make up for the money that has been lost over the years.
Thank you. Looks like we have one more question here.
Just one of the main things that came out of the Kerner Commission was when they asked the citizens, because sometimes when we talk about these communities, we don't realize these are actual tax-paying American citizens who have a right to all of the things that America offers. They said, jobs, baby. So I understand all the problems, but I'm asking you, it took 50 years and we have not answered that question. We can't inch along with the citizens for another 50 years. What recommendations do you have that we can get behind to respond to the request of these citizens for jobs?
Fair question.
The answer is
Go
not
ahead.
super complicated, be honest. You need the federal government to put more major resources into job creation. I mean, that's kind of, well, duh, we're done. The issue is political will. And that, to be honest, is kind of my frustration today, to be kind of really honest with friends, that people, the issue is political power. That I could dream an incredible world that I would love in my sleep, y'all, but I can't get there without political power. And so I would simply, as my closing thing too, simply say that, ask yourself, in whatever you do, what are you doing to build the political capacity to make the change happen? Not saying you have to quit your job to go knock on doors 24/7, but at some point you got to always ask yourself, end of the day, what did I do to build political capacity? Without that, no matter any policy we think about will not be enacted, because policies are a result of political compromises. And so the only way you get a better compromise is to have better power.
Elizabeth and Guillermo, do you want to add anything?
I thought that was a perfect closing.
Okay, and so let me also just add a little bit to what Stephen said, because I think in terms of what's needed, economists really do know what we need to do in order to have a decent jobs. And one is full employment, which is that, unemployment's now at 4.1%. It needs to go lower. There's no inflation. There's no wage pressure right now. You're just, when we maintain the economy at full employment for a protracted period of time, that's when you start to see wages grow at the bottom. That's when you start to see a closing of the racial wage gap. So that's just an essential piece. That's what leverage, that's where bargaining power comes from, is that if employers actually have to raise wages to attract workers and to keep workers and to retain workers. So that's a starting point. The other is, in terms of, you talk about government jobs programs, but we're not talking about make work. We're talking about things that every idiot can see the economy needs. We need massive investment in infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers says that we have a D+ in the United States of America just in terms of maintaining our infrastructure. There's maybe $4.6 trillion worth of work that needs to be done to maintain our bridges and our highways and our transport, let alone modernize them for the 21st century. So that's good for the economy, it's good for jobs, it's good for business, and yet we haven't been able to find the political will to get that done. And the second thing is, in terms of infrastructure, you can think about things like high-quality childcare and pre-K, which is good for everybody, creates tons of jobs. That if we were really to make sure that people had access to high-quality childcare, and we paid the people who provided that childcare decent living wage with decent benefits, that actually is a massive jobs program. So we know how to do this. These are things that pay for themselves in the sense that, some of the infrastructure improves productivity in the economy, it improves profits, and it creates good jobs. So these are the things that we need to do. And as Stephen said, let's find the political will to do it. So please join me in thanking this terrific panel, and thank all of you for sticking with it to the very end.